Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into Food Literacy for All. My name is Sammy, and today we have the pleasure of hearing from Paul Greenberg. Paul Greenberg will be speaking on four fish, oceans, sea slavery, climate change, and the future of the last wild food. The introduction song you heard today is called Wild Theme by Mark Knopfler. Food Literacy for All is hosted by the University of Michigan Sustainable Food Systems Initiative. Food Literacy for All is an evening lecture series featuring different guest speakers each week to address diverse challenges and opportunities of both domestic and global food systems. The 2025 course is organized around the theme of food and care, and we have about 200 university students enrolled in the course, and the public from around the US and the world can tune in for free. So just a quick overview of that. Food Literacy for All is co-led by Dr. Bénédicte Boisseron, a professor and the chair of the Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan. And it's also co-led by Shiloh Maples, the community organizer, seed keeper, and storyteller. For this course, we receive support and input from our community partners, which includes Oakland Avenue Urban Farm, the Detroit Food Policy Council, and the Detroit Black Community Food Sovereignty Network. These community partners help select the speakers each year and help develop the course theme. Some other team members that help make this course possible include myself, Sammy, Taylor Julene, the graduate student instructor, Sai Sharuvu, our Sustainable Food Systems Initiative coordinator, Dr. Leslie Huey, on the advisory committee, Chris Taylor, who supports our technology, and Tiffany Harris, our Food Literacy for All grader. As I mentioned earlier, Food Literacy for All is presented by the Sustainable Food Systems Initiative, and we receive generous support from the Center for the Education of Women Plus and their Francis and Sydney Lewis Visiting Leaders Fund, the School for Environment and Sustainability, and the Program in the Environment. So thank you. There's lots of different ways you can engage with Food Literacy for All. We're on X as well as Instagram. There are also poll questions for students through iClicker, which Taylor just dropped a link for that. So if you're a student enrolled in the course, please use the link to use iClicker. If you're a community member, there is no need to use that link. So just for students. And all of the classes are filmed and recorded, and they're uploaded on the Sustainable Food Systems Initiative website. During the talk, as we hear from Paul Greenberg, if you have any questions, please add them into the Q&A area. If you put them in the chat, they're more likely to get lost. So please put your questions in the Q&A spot on Zoom, and towards the end, there'll be an opportunity for him to start answering those questions. And then next, we have a student response from the readings that Paul Greenberg shared with us. And the student response is from Manan. So I will play that now.
The article, "Much of our seafood has a dark secret," dives into the core idea that if we saw a piece of fish on our plate not that long ago, we wouldn't have to guess its origin. However, given that 80% of the food in the seafood in the United States is imported, we're constantly asking questions on whether it was sourced sustainably, whether it was transparent, and how we can do better. Coming from Mumbai, India, a place where most of the ecosystem around the sea revolves around seafood, I have firsthand seen the impacts of illegal fishing and its impact on health. Secondly, it talks about how governments are subsidizing overfishing, and I think to solve this problem, governments should in fact put tariffs on illegal fishing to incentivize fisheries to source legally. Lastly, I think we should spread awareness from a young age on how to be sustainable recreationally and commercially through points mentioned in the article, such as supporting international cooperation and protecting habitats in which fish thrive. Thank you. The article, "Much of our seafood has a dark secret," dives.
Hi everyone, I'm Bénédicte Boisseron. It's my honor today to introduce the speaker, Paul Greenberg. Paul Greenberg is the author of 7 books, including the New York Times bestseller For Fish, and most recently a third term. A regular contributor to the Times and a frequent guest on national television and radio, including Fresh Air with Terry Gross. Mr. Greenberg, lectures widely at institutions ranging from TED to Harvard University to the US Supreme Court. His PBS Frontline documentary, The Fish on My Plate, was among the most viewed Frontline films of the last few years. Mr. Greenberg teaches in New York in NYU's Animal Studies program, graduate program, and lives at Ground Zero in Manhattan, where he produces, to his knowledge, the only wine grown and bottled south of 14th Street. But before we get to hear from Paul Greenberg, Taylor will join us for 2 poll questions that you would get before the talk, and you will get 1 more poll questions, an exit poll question after the talk.
Hi, everyone. It's time for our favorite part of this class, iClicker questions. If you don't have an iClicker and you're part of this class, taking this class for a grade, please click that link that I sent in the chat. If you're a community member, you'll use the Zoom polling feature. All right, so question 1, excuse me. Do you think government agencies and media give enough attention to seafood and water issues? Poll starting now. 1 sec. Pulling up the slide, so it'll send you a screenshot of the slide to your phone. Alrighty, here we go. All right, so we have 94% of the class, 177 students said B, no. They do not think the government agencies and media give enough attention to seafood and water issues. 2% said yes. All right, moving on here to question 2. 3 billion people globally rely on seafood for protein. Do you think the oceans have the capacity to meet that demand? We've got 145 responses, 160, 170. Last time we plateaued around 185, 190. So once we get to that point, we'll move on. All right, 22% of the class said yes, they do believe that the oceans have the capacity to meet that demand. 64% of the class said no. And 11% of the class said C, not sure. Luckily, we have an expert here with us tonight, and I'm very excited to learn about Paul's perspective on this issue. Closing the poll. Alrighty, Paul, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much. See if I can advance. I think you just got to click out of that poll question there. It's still lingering on top of the slides there. Or I guess I can do it. Yeah, there we go. All right. Well, I'm hoping everyone can hear and see me. I'm going to assume that they can. I'm very glad actually to hear the results of those polls too. It seems that most of you think that there's not enough attention given to the oceans and seafood and water, and I agree with you. And so we're going to start right here by giving it a little bit more attention. So just to start, a few things about me. So I teach at New York University's Animal Studies program, as was said in the introduction, but I also create a lot of public fish content. So I've written a bunch of different books. I have a TED Talk. I have a podcast like everybody else in the universe, and I have a Frontline show. But really, when it comes right down to it, the reason I'm involved with fish in the first place is that I was a lunatic fishing person growing up. And there was a period of time when you could literally not take a photograph of me unless I was holding a fish. Here I am holding a weakfish, which is a northeastern game fish caught off the island of Martha's Vineyard. And it's actually very early on threw me into writing. This is my very first article that I wrote, I think at the age of 16 or 17 for a local rag called The Fisherman. Wrote that in 1983. And as you guys saw from the reading, I'm still at it. And here's my most recent fish article, August 2024. So the publications changed, but The Fisherman remains the same. All of this has brought me into a kind of interesting career, and I'd be curious to talk with people during the Q&A afterwards about those who are interested in going into ocean stuff. But it's been a great career. I've really been able to explore lots of different things, both below the water and above the water. But I remain at heart this kind of fishing kid, and that's sort of the jumping off point for allowing me to talk to you today about fish and seafood in the oceans. So that's me, 10 years old, with the biggest fish of my life at that time, a 28-pound striped bass. So I was that kid growing up. When I was a kid, I grew up in coastal Connecticut, and I wasn't a very good athlete. I realized talking to University of Michigan, there were probably a lot of good athletes in the room, but I was a terrible athlete. And so instead of doing all the sports, fishing was really my sports. And instead of having like fall football and winter ice hockey and spring, I don't know, baseball. Every month for me was the time that a different fish came into my local waters. And at any one given time, any of these fish that you're seeing before you, I could catch. Well, I always say that one's desire to pursue fish is inversely proportional to one's desire to pursue a mate. And so as I entered my late teens, my desire to fish kind of faded away. But then as I got a little older, entered my mid-30s and so forth, I started to fish again. And when I went back to my old waters, I found not this, but rather this, that a huge amount of the diversity of the oceans that I grew up with had disappeared. When I started to talk to people about this, nobody really cared that much because, as we know, 98% of you thought that we don't give enough attention to the ocean. And I realized that I wasn't the only, it wasn't just in my fishing that this was going on. I started going to a lot of local fish markets. And when I went to fish markets, I found that no matter where I went, whether it was the South, the North, the East, the West, that there would always be these same four fish on ice. There would always be something sort of pink and succulent. That would be your salmon that you would have smoked or baked. There might be a whole fish that you would call a bass, but as we'll see later in this talk, there are many fish that get called bass. There might be something white and flaky that would be your cod that you would deep fry, right, in your fish sandwich. And there might be something sort of steaky and red that you would throw on the grill or have as sushi, and that would be your tuna. So, then I went back to my people and said, look, isn't it crazy that these same four fish appear again and again? And again, people weren't that impressed. And they really only noticed when I started talking about it in terms like this. When you get right down to it, most people don't know that much about the ocean, and they don't really think about fish as individual species. They think of them as just sort of kind of chunks of flesh, flesh archetypes, if you will. And when I started looking into this and looking at the history of humans and the kinds of things that they eat, I realized this was sort of something that we'd been to before. So if you go back 30, 50,000 years, and you look at what humans eat, you look in their fire pits, you'll see all kinds of mammals. You'll see, raccoons, foxes, hoofed mammals, antlered animals, all these different animals that we ate. But telescope to the age of animal husbandry, starting at the Holocene around 10,000 going forward, you start to see us paring down to four essential mammals. So cows, pigs, sheep, and goats. Same thing turns out holds true for birds. If you go back, not even that far, if you go back and look at New York City restaurant menus, which we have on archive at the New York Public Library, you'll see dozens of different birds that we ate, snipe and woodcock and grouse, all these different wild birds. But again, telescope to the age of modern animal husbandry, and you see four, right? Chickens, turkeys, ducks, and geese. So I started to realize that we were in the process of winnowing down the ocean to what we wanted to eat, not necessarily what served the world and the ecology. And what I started to understand as I explored this more deeply, that this had huge implications, not just for fish, but for human rights as well. So how did we get to this point of winnowing down to these four fish? Well, so here is a graph of fishing over the last 70 or so years. And you'll see since World War II that we've basically quadrupled the amount of fish that we take out of the ocean every year. Right now, we take something like 90 million metric tons out of the ocean every single year. That's the equivalent of the human weight of China taken out of the sea every single year. But there's this other thing going on, which is the birth of aquaculture, fish farming. That is the fastest growing protein production system on the planet. And it's gotten to the point where I guess, 100 years ago, everything we ate from the sea more or less was wild. Now more than half is coming to us from the farm. So if you add those two together, you get this staggering amount. You get 2 human weights of China, 160 million metric tons taken out of the sea each and every year, all just for humans to eat. What is interesting is that even though aquaculture is making up a huge portion of the amount of fish that we eat, we over here in the United States actually don't grow a lot of fish. China, of course, is way up at the top, India way at the top, Indonesia, but we only produce something like 0.4 million metric tons of farmed seafood per year. And we'll discuss that a little bit later in the talk. So that became the architecture of this book, For Fish, and the architecture of this talk, which is that this apical shift, going from an all-wild system to a half-farm system, going from a diverse array of creatures that we might have drawn from to winnowing down to a few select four. And so that's the architecture of this talk, and allows me to talk really about what's going on in the ocean in general through the lens of these four fish. So let's start with the most popular fish. This is the most popular fish in America right now. If I were in the room with you, I would say, raise your hand if you ate salmon last week, but I'm pretty sure almost everyone would say, or probably at least half of you would say you ate it last week. So what is salmon? What are we talking about? We're talking about salmon. So most of the time in this country, we're eating a species of salmon called Atlantic salmon, Salmo salar, the salmon that jumps. And then there are 5 other Pacific salmons that live on the West Coast, but they actually live in your Great Lakes as well, but we'll tell you that story in a second. So what I found in this first chapter of For Fish is that this is a journey from a fish called Salmo salar to what scientists are calling Salmo domesticated, the domesticated salmon. And how did that happen, and why did that happen? Well, first of all, this chart is sort of useful to look at. So this is fishing in the North Atlantic over the last, say, 150 years or so. And you'll notice there are these 2 big dips right around World War I and World War II. I always say if that history were written by fish, this would be called Great Reprieve number 1 and Great Reprieve number 2. So these reprieves from fishing show that we really did hit the North Atlantic super hard, but then after World War II, we hit it even harder and tried to get more and more fish. Why? Because after World War II, agriculture had been devastated. We needed more protein. And what happened when we went looking for more fish? Well, we went on these fishing expeditions to faraway waters to try and figure out how we could get more fish. So this is a map of where all the Atlantic salmon in the Atlantic go when they migrate. So just for those of you who don't know fish that well, salmon, they spawn in freshwater, migrate down into saltwater, go out into the open ocean, forage, get big and fat, and come back to their native rivers and spawn again. These 2 areas that I'm showing here on this chart here, one of them off Greenland and one of them off the Faroe Islands, is the place where all Atlantic salmon went to feed. And when those fishing expeditions started post-World War II, they fished those areas and they fished them extremely hard, leading to a wide-scale extirpation of salmon across their range. Now, always when you have the extirpation of a fish through fishing, there's always an environmental component a lot of times. So this is my home state of Connecticut. This is the way it should look. But these are all the dams in the state of Connecticut. There are over 4,000 dams in the state of Connecticut alone. I always say this is why people in Connecticut are so uptight. Their chi is blocked by these little dams that are all over the place. All these dams were built actually to serve land food largely, to grind corn, to grind wheat, build sawmills, all those kinds of things. And it led to a very rapid extirpation of salmon in Connecticut and all up and down the American coast where those dams were also built. And you guys also here have an environmental shift story in the Great Lakes. So some of you, I'm sure there are a few fish heads in the room, but many of you may not know that the Great Lakes, upon which you sit near, used to be cut off more or less from the sea. A huge barrier in the form of Niagara Falls prevented invasive species from entering the Great Lakes. Well, after the Erie Canal was built, and then later the Welland Canal was built, the ocean was opened up to the Great Lakes, and a creature called the sea lamprey, which is that middle picture you see there, got in. And you guys have a kind of salmon native to the Great Lakes. It's a lake trout. Trout and salmon are very close. Actually, lake trout is a char, but they're all within the same family. Anyway, lamprey devastated lake trout. There used to be a huge commercial fishery for them in the Great Lakes, devastated all over the place, all over the Great Lakes. And also you had a huge dam building spree throughout the Great Lakes as well. There's something like 2,500 dams in the state of Michigan alone. So what do you do when you knock out your wild fish? This is when you turn to aquaculture. So this is For Fish, right? Our For Fish that I introduced at the beginning. And this is the For Fish larval edition. So these are all the baby fish of shown in the slide. So notice the fish at the top. the fish in the top has a very large yolk sac. And what that does is it allows a baby salmon to live off that yolk sac and then transition onto industrial feed. It makes it the perfect feed for fish for aquaculture. You guys might know this if you ever go to sushi. You might know these eggs looking like this, but what they really do is enable aquaculture. And aquaculture just burst onto the scene with salmon in the 1950s and 60s. This is a map of Norway. Every dot on that map is a salmon farm. And it's a huge social justice issue because a lot of those places, those fjords where those salmon farms went in were for working class fishermen who worked those areas, and they got pushed out by those salmon farms. What do you do when all your fjords fill up with salmon farms? Well, you go even bigger. And this is, global capitalism at its mightiest. This picture I took in Puerto Montt, Chile. This is a stack of salmon in a place where salmon don't even exist naturally. There are no salmon native south of the equator. So they filled up all of those fjords in southern Chile with salmon, introducing basically an invasive species, and again, causing all these social justice issues, displacing local fishermen, all these kinds of things that went on down the line. Meanwhile, though, there's another problem with farm salmon, in that salmon require other fish to eat in order to grow. At the early days of salmon farming, as much as 5 pounds of wild salmon 5 pounds of wild other fish for 1 pound of salmon. That has gotten better, down to 2 pounds of wild fish for every pound of salmon. But we produce so much farm salmon now that there is no reduction in the amount of little wild fish that are eaten. And again, we have a social justice issue. All of those little fish that we feed for salmon are vital for communities in coastal Africa, coastal South America, all over the world. So there's been this huge little fish rush where all of these, what had been artisan local fisheries, are turned into industrial fisheries to feed Western countries, rich countries with farmed salmon. That was Africa, and this is Peru. So what do we do about that then? Well, how do we get around that? Well, is there any way to make these farm salmon eat less fish? Well, at one point, about 30 years ago, they came up with a genetically modified salmon. And this was an Atlantic salmon at the top with a Pacific salmon in the middle, and then a growth gene from a third fish called an ocean pout. And it made a fish that grew twice as fast with half the amount of feed. They struggled for years and years and years to get this through Food and Drug Administration. It got through a few years ago, but the company just recently this year went out of business, Aqua Bounty, that created the AQ Advantage fish. So if you ever have this idea that you're eating genetically modified salmon, you are not. That company never got off the ground, but certainly people are going to try again. Now, it's important to remember that the United States actually has a lot of wild salmon left in our waters. This is Bristol Bay in Alaska. It's a home to 50 million wild salmon that come into our ecosystem every year. There's so many of them that when you fish for rainbow trout, which if anglers are weird, they always want to fish for the fish that's not available. But when you fish for rainbow trout in this part of Alaska, you use this fly, which is called a flesh fly, which imitates rotting flesh falling off of a spawned out salmon. So I actually used this flesh fly, and I caught a rainbow trout in Alaska one time, and it was so full of salmon fed energy that it slipped out of the guide's hands, and it kept going, and it kept going, and it kept going. This is not Photoshop. This is the amazing power of these fish fed by all the salmon in the system. Guide actually caught the fish, put it back in the water, and it shot off at 10 knots, an incredibly powerful, well-fed ecosystem. And it feeds the salmon of Alaska, have a great artisanal fishery with really great young people working. They're very handsome. They fish under rainbows. That's a joke, but there actually was a rainbow that day I took this picture. But why don't we value this more? Why are we so not really focused on our own fisheries and instead importing all this farm salmon? Well, a weird factor of our fisheries here is that a lot of Alaskan salmon gets caught in the United States, frozen whole, turned around, sent to China, where the labor prices are a fraction of what they are here. Some might even say they are slave labor amounts of low-level price for labor. So those salmon are defrosted, filleted, the little bones are picked out by hand. Then that fillet is refrozen, and surprise, surprise, it's sent back to us, and we're getting it a lot of times double frozen. So we've completely outsourced what should be a good working wage of fish processing to a country that is paying wages that are close to slave labor. And what does that do from an environmental perspective? Well, like this is Bristol Bay, as I say, this amazing wild salmon fishery, and this is what's coming down the pike. There are all these mining claims in this area. They want to put the largest copper and gold mine atop what is the largest spawning ground for salmon in the United States. It's such a popular fishery, though, that even this guy, look at who that is. That's Donald Trump Jr., and he's fishing with his son, D3. And he's saying, this is an amazing place. If you haven't read about the amazing journey these fish make and the transformations they make in their life, you should, because it's unbelievable. I agreed with him, and I put this on the cover of the New York Times. And we actually helped stop this mine. Now that we have a new administration with maybe the same designs, we're going to have to watch this very carefully, because we have to remember this is our food. This is our food sovereignty. And who is the government to give that fish away to a mining company that might destroy it? Okay, so that's our first fish. I spend a lot of time on the first fish just because it is the most popular fish. So the next fish is this fish sort of broadly called bass. There are a lot of fish called bass, over 7 taxonomic families. On the East Coast, we have the American striped bass. On the southern coast of the United States, we have what's called a channel bass, which is also called a red drum. And then there's other fish that are on the West Coast as well. But it's important to remember that all of these bass require wetlands, and wetlands are key for fish reproduction. Michigan has lost 50% of its wetlands. So when I talk about the devastation of the commercial fisheries that the Great Lakes used to have, a lot of it is because of its wetlands. And if you lose your wetlands, you lose your fish, plain and simply. And that's what we're dealing with. So same thing, as I say, similar thing in California with the California white sea bass. And once you lose all those native fish, that's when we start looking abroad. And so some of you may remember a few decades ago, a fish was introduced called the Chilean sea bass. Now this fish is basically caught in Antarctica. It has nothing to do with what we call bass. In fact, I always say that if you were to compare taxonomically a Chilean sea bass with some of these other fish that I've been showing you, they have about as much in common taxonomically as the ring-tailed lemur and my son, Luke Greenberg. But nevertheless, they fall into this market name bass. And by the way, a lot of those Chilean sea bass are often caught by illegal fishing. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So what do you do then when that fish gets overfished? Well, then once again, you turn to aquaculture. And that's where this next fish that came online about 20 years ago, called the European sea bass. A lot of you probably didn't even know this fish, what this fish was. But when you go out to dinner, I'm sure you've seen this thing, they'll call it branzino or loup de mer or some other kind of name, or just European sea bass. This fish is actually a farmed fish. And remember when I was talking about the aquaculture of salmon, how they hatch out of this big nutrient-rich egg and they can go right to industrial feed? Well, European sea bass and most marine fish actually hatch out of a very tiny egg, and they have to eat live feed as soon as they hatch. So in order to farm them, we had to figure out a way to feed them live feed. And what did we feed them? We fed them these. These are Artemia shrimp. Artemia shrimp, where do they come from? They come from the Great Salt Lake. I always thought the Great Salt Lake was a completely dead place, but in fact, it's live, full of these little shrimp that form these cysts that are so indestructible. You can fly them into space, you can bury them for 1,000 years, and still they'll hatch out. Some of the older people in the community might remember being duped by this ad. Sea monkeys were these things sold on the back of comic books. They're actually Artemia shrimp that were from the Great Salt Lake. But what they're really used for today is as an engine to drive global aquaculture. And something like 50% of all the Artemia in the world come from our Great Salt Lake. But why is that a problem? Well, Great Salt Lake is dying. This is a shot of the Great Salt Lake from a recent trip. The right half has become too salty because land food agriculture is taking too much water out of the north end of the lake. A causeway across the middle of the lake that was built by a railroad in the 60s keeps that salinity gradient off to one side. But basically, because the lake is drying up, it's getting too saline, and we might lose this engine for global aquaculture. All right, so that's our second fish. Our third fish is cod. And this is sort of another indistinct fish. This is the flaky fish in your fish sandwich. You may or may not know that it's cod, but you've certainly probably had a fish sandwich if you're not a vegan. The original sort of fast food of cod was in this dried form. Cod have very low moisture content, so you can hang them up to dry, and they dry sort of almost like a piece of cardboard. There's a shot I took in Lofoten Island, which is a major port for codfish. Now, where this ties into our larger story about justice and food systems has to do with its historical reputation. So you probably all read about triangular trade when you were in school, and something about the manufactured goods going to America, and then us producing other stuff in the Northeast, and then eventually down south, cotton and indigo and all that stuff being the third leg in the triangle. But what they never tell you about in school is this little circle down on the lower left, which is the fish part. There would have been no triangular trade had there not been codfish. Dried codfish were the protein source for slaves in the American South and the Caribbean South. One of the reasons so much Caribbean food has salt cod as a base is that it's basically a food that came out of slavery. It was cheap. It was impervious to rot, and so it became the fish and the part of triangular trade. Today, though, you're more likely to see codfish in this form, this high form of art of culinary cuisine, the fillet of fish sandwich. And it's kind of an interesting story, actually. There was no fillet of fish sandwich before the late 1960s. The original fillet of fish, originally, there was no fish sandwich. And nearby in Cleveland, a franchise owner found that nobody was coming into his store on a Friday afternoon. Why? Well, they were Catholics, and the Catholics eat fish on Friday. So he introduced this fish sandwich, even though Ray Kroc wanted to do a pineapple sandwich, the head of McDonald's at the time. He said, no, let's try a fish sandwich, and the fish sandwich really took off. The original fillet of fish was made out of halibut. Ray Kroc said, no, that's 65 cents a sandwich. I need a cheaper sandwich. So they swapped in cod. Cod then was overfished in the late 1980s. The biggest source of codfish in the world, the Grand Banks off of Canada, was closed. So then we switched to another fish, the Alaska pollock, which comes from Alaska. Now, you probably don't know this fish at all, but you might know it in this form. If you've ever eaten a California roll, it is the fake crab at the center of a California roll. It's a product called surimi. Those of you who watch Curb Your Enthusiasm might remember that Larry and Cheryl break up because during sex, Larry can't stop talking about the difference between fake crab and real crab. Well, this is the fake crab. It's Alaska pollock. And then beyond that, we are even hitting the limits of Alaska pollock, even though it's 2 to 3 billion pounds of fish that comes out of the American Gulf of Alaska for the pollock. And so now, once again, what have we turned to? Aquaculture and tilapia. Tilapia is now, I think, the 5th or 6th most consumed seafood in America. I always like to show this slide because it shows you the great confusion in the American seafood system. This is, you have the Gorton's fishermen. Those of you in the room who are from the East Coast might recognize Gorton's of Gloucester. And you have this guy in his oilskins, and he's going out and he's fishing for tilapia, which is an African origin fish that dies in water under 60 degrees. So there's no way that the Gorton's fisherman is catching you tilapia. It's part of the international conglomerate of farmed seafood that is getting to you mostly via China or South America. And then the 6th most consumed seafood in America is this crazy fish. It's called the Pangasius catfish. This is a fish that most of the time when it appears, it doesn't even appear with a name. It's just fish. You go into the hospital for a procedure. They say, what would you like, chicken or fish? And you say, what's the fish? They say, I don't know. It's just fish. Chances are it is this Pangasius catfish. So that's that's that whole world of fish. That's the codfish. So our 4th fish is tuna. Now, tuna really brings us to the brink, and it brings us to the brink not just of marine food systems, but also what we're willing to perpetrate on our fellow human. So tuna in its canned form are the top 2 fish, usually skipjack tuna or longfin albacore. In its sort of steaky, sort of sushi form, it's going to be yellowfin or big eye or bluefin. The 2 of them are at the bottom. But the difficulty of tuna is that they are global wanderers. They cross the oceans. And so in order to manage them, you have to have these what are called regional fisheries management organizations that span the oceans and try and keep track of fish all over the place. Our particular regional fisheries management organization is called ICAT, the International Commission on the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas. My friend Carl Safina, the great writer, calls it the International Conspiracy to Catch All the Tuna. We've certainly been through some very bad times with tuna. They're actually a little bit on the upswing, particularly the big ones like bluefin tuna, but you could see the problem in trying to manage them. There's a big problem that has to do with ocean management, which is ocean ownership. Now, just a little nod back in time, up until about early 1980s, there was this doctrine that was preached in the sea that was called Mare Liberum, the free seas, and it was perpetrated by this guy named Hugo Grotius, who in the 17th century said the oceans should be open to everybody and everybody should be allowed to do whatever they want with them. Starting in the late 70s and going into the early 80s, we formed something called the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which basically said that every nation owns its ocean out to 200 nautical miles. And so what you've created are these funny donuts throughout the ocean, where you have little nations that might be tiny, tiny specks in the ocean, but they have a huge amount of ocean ownership. And that's super, super important for tuna management. What's happening, though, is that these little countries that own all of this ocean are getting bullied by the larger countries. Countries like the United States, like China, are pushing their way into those waters to try and get those fish. And if they can't get into those national waters, look at all the open space between all of those national sovereignties. That's what's called the high seas and international waters. And it is basically a lawless place. A lawless frontier, as my friend Ian Urbina calls it, in this amazing thing you should totally check out called the Outlaw Ocean Project. In the high seas, it's very, very hard to regulate, and it's really ground zero of sea slavery. It's where people get abducted. It's where people get forced into fishing for sometimes years at a time, never seeing home. I'm not a huge expert on this, but Ian Urbina is, and certainly check out the outlawocean.com. Got amazing documentation. I love this picture because the journalist in the foreground knows that there are slaves on this ship. He's put a note in a bottle with a pencil, a notepad with a pencil. He's throwing it onto the ship and saying, if you are being enslaved, fill this note out, throw it back in the bottle, throw it back into the sea. And they actually got eyewitness reports of the slavery through that very, very courageous act. And it's important to remember that as much as 20% of the seafood Americans eat is caught illegally, and a large but a noble part is processed by slave labor or by companies with a record of severe labor abuses. This is a photo from the Outlaw Ocean. It's a shrimp factory in India that was suspected of having impressed labor. So once again, we could try to farm tuna, and they've tried to farm it, but because tuna are warm-blooded and swim at 40 miles an hour, farming them is ridiculous. It takes 20 pounds of wild fish to make a pound of farmed tuna. And they really are much more close to wildlife, I think, in a way, than they are to, food. This amazing picture by James Prozek sort of shows you the amazing quality of wild bluefin tuna. And I guess I'd say that before we put our fork in it, we ought to think, is this an animal or is this food? Is this wildlife or is this seafood? It's a big question going forward. Okay, so that's our 4 fish, but I've added a 5th special guest star, which is our shrimp. Now, I mentioned earlier that salmon are the most popular fish in the United States to eat, but the most popular seafood is shrimp, and we eat twice as much shrimp as we do salmon. And it's particularly problematic. Shrimp in its wild form is tremendously fuel intensive to catch. And in its farm form, it has a double climate wallop. So this is a mangrove forest, a picture I took in Vietnam. This is the way the coast of the tropics should look, with mangroves holding in the soil, protecting the coast, providing habitat. This is the way mangrove forests look after shrimp farms have come in and torn out all those mangroves and made shrimp farms. This is happening. We've lost millions and millions of acres of mangrove forest. And it's important because mangrove forests are actually better carbon sequesters than tropical rainforests. So we're losing mangrove forests just so that we can eat shrimp. And yes, once again, there's a slavery component. Beginning in the mid-2010s, a series of investigations started by The Guardian revealed that particularly Thailand was implicated in huge amounts of slave labor in the shrimp processing industry. So it's also important to remember that we've got a problem here. All these things that I've laid out to you, I think hopefully now you think that more attention needs to be paid to seafood and ocean stuff. But the problem is Americans eat only about 10 kilograms of seafood per person per year compared to 70 kilograms of land food meat. But we're such a big country that we have a huge effect on the ocean. We actually eat more total fish than a very fishy place like Japan. And the fish that we do eat is really, really high carbon intensity, high value, high cost to the planet overall. So the US strongly affects the oceans, but because we eat so little seafood per capita, we don't have enough personal investment to care. So should we just give up on seafood? I hope we can discuss this during the Q&A. Maybe some people have already said, I'm done. Well, let's look at it, though, in context of land food. Let's look at seafood America versus land food America. We spend $5 billion just on subsidizing corn, whereas all of the fish in America, be they wild or farmed, gets a single billion. That's a huge, huge difference. We also really affect our seafood through the way we grow our land food. Adjacent to, not too far from your university, I'm sure there's lots of land like this, and you think, oh, it's farms, they're growing food. But what you don't realize is that underneath all of this farmland is an entirely huge plumbing system that's draining fertilizer from the land. And it's fertilizer like this. This is a fertilizer depot in Minnesota that I shot a number of years ago. All that fertilizer is going down into waterways. This is called tiling. Something like 50 million acres of American farmland has been tiled, draining the equivalent of Ohio and Pennsylvania combined. All of that fertilizer goes into the Gulf of Mexico, causes a dead zone that's bigger than the state of Connecticut every single year, a zone in which harvestable seafood is frankly not there. And if you notice where the dead zone is, this is where poor Americans, food insecure Americans are. Imagine if they had access to that seafood, but they can't because we're killing it through land food upstream. So by ignoring fish and seafood, we prioritize water as a commodity and waste disposal system for agriculture instead of a food and wildlife system. And land food is also super climate intensive. If you look at the land foods that we eat, beef, over 100 kilos of CO2 per kilo of beef produced. Cheese, some of us go vegetarian and we think, oh, I'll do cheese. Well, cheese is still pretty high. Actually, cheese turns out to be higher than chicken in terms of CO2 emissions. Fish, on the other hand, is quite low. Wild fish overall has much, much lower emissions than all of these farmed land products. Of course, lentils are great, and those of us who are vegetarians certainly have eaten our share of lentils, but check it out. Look at mussels. Farmed mussels can actually be better from a carbon perspective than lentils. So what would be the ideal diet going forward? Well, so a lot of us are trapped in this industrial diet where there's a lot of, processed meat, processed food. A lot of us have heard about the Mediterranean diet where we're going to have more and more vegetables, hopefully more whole grains, and just a little bit of meat. And then there's something I would like to propose, which I would call the pescatarian diet, which is something where we'd eat mostly vegetables, a mostly vegetarian diet, but we'd supplement with a few select seafoods that I think are good for us and good for the planet. We might look at things like anchovies, things that are normally fed to feed salmon, but actually are quite nutritious in and of themselves. Very, very low carbon intensity. We might also look at things like clams, mussels, oysters, seaweeds, all of which filter the water, make it cleaner, and are super low in carbon emissions. All of these, I should add, are very high in omega-3 fatty acids, which particularly for children is really important for brain development. And then we also, as a country, need to look at aquaculture. We're not farming a lot of seafood. Remember, it was something like 0.4 million metric tons compared to 75 million metric tons of China. But if we're going to do it, we got to do it smart. So we want to feed these fish, not other fish, but there's all these interesting ways that you can feed fish now. You can make algae from photosynthesis that has all these nutrients that fish need. You can take garbage, actually food waste, feed it to something called a black soldier fly larva, and that actually is full of protein that fish need. So it's a way of actually recycling food waste. We want a fast-growing fish because we want to get it through that system quickly. And we want it to be adaptable. There are a lot of different things that are sort of putting out there right now. I know that wind farms are really on the ropes right now in the present administration, but people are talking about pairing offshore wind farms with aquaculture, where we could actually grow fish and mussels and clams right next to wind farms. So in conclusion, I hope I've given you a little bit of a taste of the kinds of struggles that are out there, the kinds of things that we're fighting with. I know a lot of us, who are dealing with justice issues, who are dealing with food security issues, who are dealing with just plain equity issues. We all feel on the ropes right now. But the fight for good fish and clean water is a state-by-state fight for justice, and I think that it's a fight that we can win. We're going to win it on a local level, we're going to win it on a regional level, we're going to win it on a state level. So with that, I'll turn it over to Q&A, and thank you so much for your attention.
Awesome. That was a wonderful talk, Paul. I feel so lucky to have you here and so inspired. And I'm really excited to keep in touch with you and keep an eye on your work and read some of your books.
Great.
Great stuff.
And also, these are all my contacts. So if you want to, after the talk, if you go to paulgreenberg.org, there's a contact button. So feel free to message me that way.
Awesome. Okay, before we move into Q&A, and we have some great Q&A questions right now, we are going to do a beloved iClicker question. All right. So here we go. Open up your iClicker. We have question 3 here. After Paul Greenberg's talk, how likely are you to pursue future learning opportunities about seafood and water issues? Starting now. And please excuse the screenshot on my phone or on my desktop. Here we go. We've got 150 responses now. 32% of people said they're very likely to pursue further learning opportunities about seafood and water issues. 50% said they're likely. We have 15% who said they are neutral. Only 3% said unlikely, and very unlikely, 0 people.
Yes.
Woohoo!
That's the kind of effect we're looking for from the talk.
All right, so we'll close that out. And then we'll get into Q&A. All right, so let's see, to start, we have from, pulling it up here, from Tyler B. Is there any aquaculture system similar to land-based agroecological systems that facilitate more biodiversity and provide some sort of matrix?
Excellent question. So, if you go back to the very, very beginning of aquaculture, 3,000 years, in fact, that began in China, they were actually originally diverse multi-trophic systems. The original Chinese systems would have silkworms growing on mulberry trees overhanging the banks of ponds. The casings from the silkworms fell into the water. Those fed carp, which you could then harvest after they'd grown to a certain size. The carp, in turn, when they pooped, fertilized the shallow waters into which rice was planted. Also, grasses were there and ducks were harvested. So it was a multi-way polyculture. In modern days, people have been trying to figure out a way to kind of replicate that. Keep in mind, those ponds were probably on a very, very small scale. And now we're, of course, in a sort of industrial food environment. So people are trying to figure out, could we scale this up? So there's a discipline that's been emerging called aquaponics. And there are a few, I would bet you somewhere in Detroit is an aquaponics facility where, usually it's something like tilapia being grown and then maybe some salad greens put on top. The difficulty comes when you try to scale up, because if you have too much nutrients in the water, you can end up really blowing out the system. And when you get an infection in a system like that, especially if it's just in a controlled, closed tank, you can lose all your fish, and then you got to start from scratch. There are some pilot projects with salmon where you grow salmon, and then again, the effluent coming from the salmon farm could potentially nourish kelp. And probably those foodie people in the audience know that kelp is kind of a thing right now. A lot of people are talking about kelp burgers and kelp blah blah and this that. And you could also grow mussels with some of that effluent, and then even put sea cucumbers on the floor of a salmon pen to eat the uneaten feed pellets. But I've never seen anything really have huge commercial success. I would imagine there are still some of those artisan ponds from ancient Chinese tradition still functioning in China somewhere. But it's definitely, if you think of yourself as a food entrepreneur, somebody who's excited about those kinds of things, I think it's really an interesting opportunity to try to pursue and to try and nail down. It's be a great thing for our world to have.
Great, thank you so much. Eleanor asks, do you anticipate that seafloor mining will take off? And if so, do you expect that this will devastate global fish stocks and increase demand for aquaculture?
It's a really good question. So I teach a class at NYU called The People versus the Sea, and we usually have a section on offshore mining. I usually bring in a guest named Diva Amon. I would recommend looking her up. She's based out of Trinidad and Tobago. So, this is the Wild West right now. Nobody is really actively mining the seabed yet. That is still being worked out within the United Nations. Often that is very much in the deep sea, and I think the concern is not so much for commercial fisheries as it is for very fragile deep water corals and deep water ecosystems. Remember, the deeper you go, the slower you grow. And so if you cause a disruption at the very deep level, that could be a problem. There's all sorts of, this stuff hasn't really been worked out. There's all kinds of plumes that could potentially come out of a deep water mining operation. There's also, I had a student last year who did a paper on it, and I think he called his paper something like Deep Water Mining, a Real Thing or Fool's Gold. And there is an element where there's a certain kind of person who just was trying to push up stock prices by trying to really push this idea of deep water mining. I think it's going to play out in the next 5 years. Again, if you're somebody who's looking to get into environmental policy, certainly a very cutting edge issue, and certainly there'll be room for you at the table if you want a job in that world.
Thank you very much. We have some students in the class who are in the School of Nutrition. So we have a question from Victoria. Are there differences in the nutrition content, of farmed versus wild fish?
So, you probably, if you haven't done it already this semester, you're going to look at omega-3s. And that is the nutrient that people are most concerned about from a nutritional point of view when we talk about fish. The amount of omega-3s in a fish is almost entirely dependent on what you feed it. So you actually can have a farmed fish with higher omega-3s than a wild fish if you feed it enough fish oil right before you harvest it. The one thing, though, that has been, people have been concerned about, I don't know if in your nutrition classes, if you've talked about the question of omega-6s versus omega-3s. So omega-6s, land food tends to skew more in the direction of omega-6 and seafood towards omega-3s. As aquaculture companies have been feeding seafood more and more agricultural byproducts, soy, corn leavings, and so forth, the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio has changed in farm fish. So there's almost no omega-6 in a wild fish, but there are significant amounts in a farmed fish. Even though you might be able to raise the omega-3 levels, you can't get rid of the omega-6. So it's all very theoretical. Some people think the whole thing is a bunch of nonsense, the omega-6 thing, but that is probably the biggest difference. The other thing is, of course, wild fish are going to be much more exposed to pollutants. Although both wild and farm fish have equal amounts of microplastics, there's no getting around that, we're finding. But things like PCBs and mercury mostly come into fish through what they eat. And if you can control what they eat on the farm, then you're obviously going to have a better shot at not having high levels of PCBs and mercury.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Emily. Emily says, you mentioned that post-World War I or World War II, maybe I misheard. The amount of fish we have taken from the water has quadrupled. Is there a specific historical reason for this shift?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, it's more people. But that's the sort of base reason. But the technology has gotten much better. World War II is actually a big driver of it for many reasons. As I mentioned in the talk, a tremendous amount of new people fishing, new expeditions going out to find fish to make up for the lack of agriculture in the wake of World War II. But the war itself developed all these technologies that were meant for warfare that actually turned out to be very useful for fishing. So ships that could travel great distances without refueling. Sonar, which in the past was used to find submarines, you could tune it up and use it to find fish. all these new kinds of lightweight polymers that might have been used for war material can be fashioned into fishing nets and fishing lines. So I would say the combination of population growth and the availability of new technology is probably what is driving it most of all. Also, beyond that, if you look at some of the theoretical work being done around fisheries, for a long time, people didn't think the oceans had any limits. As I mentioned, we're taking 80, things seem to plateau when we hit about 80 to 90 million metric tons from the sea every year. But as recently as the 19th century, people thought that that limit could be more like 400 million metric tons. So no one ever thought to kind of constrain themselves. No one ever thought that there might be a bad side to fishing too much.
It's kind of interesting how war technology seamlessly found its way into our food system.
It's really true. It's really true. If you Google around, I did on, I think it was like, I can't remember if it was like a 70th anniversary of World War II. But so me and so I'm Jewish, and a German fisheries guy named Boris Worm, we decided for end of World War II, it'd be kind of cool if we collaborated. And we did this piece called The War on Fish, which is basically saying that the end of World War II was the end of war on humans, but it began a war on fish. And we talked about all that war technology.
I know Boris Worm's work, rather.
Yes, he's definitely worth looking at his work.
We have a question from Danny. Danny asks, you mentioned wetland as an essential environmental component. Would you be able to talk a little bit about wetland credits in the context of land development?
Sure. A lot of stuff is negotiated by lawyers, and lawyers always have funny ways of compensating for loss. I did a recent piece called Bird Years Lost, and it was all about how mercury polluters wanted to restore birds to the state of Virginia after a mercury spill. And the only way they could, because they couldn't figure out a way to get the mercury out, they bought wetlands in Central America where the songbirds migrated. The principle is similar. New York City is never going to get all of its wetlands back. And yet there are developers who want to continue to build stuff. So if you can put into environmental policy the cost, and you say that, like, every new building has to have X number of acres of wetlands, whether or not wetlands were destroyed in the process of making that building, that can be a driver of more wetlands. Now, that might seem unfair to the developer, but when you think about it, wetlands do so many things. They make more food, but they also do a huge amount in terms of coastal protection. And in general, I'm all in favor of it. Also, salt marshes are amongst the greatest carbon sequesters of all ecosystems. I think it's another one that does better than tropical rainforests in terms of carbon sequestration. So, more wetlands. I mentioned state of Michigan's lost 50% of its wetlands. We're in a wetlands hole right now. We're seeing things like forests. We've been reforesting this country for some time now, and we're doing pretty good by that score. But wetlands were way, way, way behind. So any piece of legislation or incentive that can be used to restore wetlands, I think, will be good for our own security, good for our food security, and good for for climate mitigation as well.
Thank you very much. We have a question here for pet lovers. Mild, what kind of impact does cat food have on fish consumption and harvest?
Yeah, good question. Well, so I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times about 15 years ago called Cat Got Your Fish. And it began when my cat Coco died. And I was saying how it was bad for Coco, but it was kind of good for the ocean. The average, I've heard the statistic, I've never been able to track it down to its source, but I've heard it said that the average American cat eats more fish than the average African human. And we certainly do prioritize our pets. A lot of reduction, when I mentioned the fish feed business, the aqua feed business, where all this boiling down of little fish, that's called the reduction industry. And the reduction industry certainly makes use of, or certainly serves the pet industry as well. So, it's funny, when I wrote that piece, I remember I interviewed somebody who was raising vegan cats, and I'm not so in favor of that. I mean, I think cats are natively obligate carnivores, and it's a little bit cruel to kind of subject them to our sort of whims and wishes. If you have to go in that direction, it's probably better just to get a guinea pig or something that's sort of a natural herbivore. But yes, pets do have an impact. The bigger the pet, the bigger the impact. Dogs bigger than cats, and they're probably eating some fish as well. So it's certainly something to consider. It's certainly something to consider when you're making a choice of buying an animal, but I don't think you should make your cat into a vegan.
Understood. A question from Cheryl. With fish farming, are fish exposed to overcrowding and thus waste contamination?
Yeah, so there is overcrowding for sure. Interestingly, in this country, we don't have an organic farmed fish standard, largely because the wild fish industry doesn't want organic fish on the market, because a consumer would get confused, right? They'd see wild fish. Should I get the wild or the organic? Oh, I guess I'll get the organic, but the organic is farmed. The reason I mention it is that in Europe, they do have an organic standard, and part of the standard is a limited of certain number of fish per cubic meter of water. And they try to control that to some degree. But many fish farms really shove it in there. I mentioned the Pangasius catfish earlier as the 6th most consumed seafood in America. That picture of that catfish, you might have noticed there are a few little air holes right around its snout. Those fish get crowded in so tightly that at a certain point they stick their little faces above the water and they breathe air. They're actually air breathing, and even that's actually a stressful thing for them to do. But those fish farms in certain parts of the world are so densely populated that the fish are forced into this stress air breathing situation. And yes, and diseases, of course, go along with that. Stress diseases, but the other major disease of fish farming is something called a sea louse. It's an ectoparasite that sticks to the outside of farmed fish, particularly salmon. And if you put a salmon farm in the middle of a wild salmon run, the young salmon going by get hit with these ectoparasites, and it can also often be a really devastating effect on wild salmon. Delete and replace, I call it.
Thank you. We have a question from Nicole. Do you see a need for updated international policy agreements regarding ocean ownership and fisheries, especially considering the slave labor and pushing local fishermen out of the system?
Yeah, well, there have been, ever since these series of reports started to drop about sea slavery, there has been more and more talk of it. There have been some movements by the US government to try and not allow ships that on their manifest seem to indicate that they have slaves aboard to dock. There was different kinds of, trying to regulate trade, if something was suspected of having been tainted by slavery, to hold that stuff up at the border. There was a big pressure campaign against a company called Thai Union for all of its implications around slave labor in the shrimp industry. So those are some things. There is in progress a high seas treaty, and some people actually, there's a movement to create. There's something going within the UN called 30 by 30, where they want to basically put 30% of the ocean in marine protected area by the year 2030. And a big target for that is the high seas in international waters. The idea being that we just seem to not be able to control international waters. And the logic among conservationists is if you can't control it, then you shouldn't be allowed to fish it. So there is a lot of activity around trying to create a high seas treaty, which I believe has passed in one way, shape, or form, but I'm not a huge expert on international law, but I know that people I work with are working on that topic very heavily.
We have a question, well, rather two similar questions coming from Tiffany and Cheryl. Can you share a little bit more about the color dyeing of fish? What percentage of salmon or other fish is dyed for the purpose of selling it on the market?
So colorant, as far as I know, is mostly a salmon thing. If you were to take a farmed salmon and not color it's actually the dye. The dye is actually gone into the feed, and that's what gives them the color. But if you didn't do that, farm salmon would look kind of grayish color, grayish white. Wild salmon get their pigment from krill, which in turn get it from phytoplankton. The red pigment in phytoplankton is actually kind of a sunscreen that in higher latitudes prevents ultraviolet light from getting into and disrupting their DNA. So if you're not feeding your fish krill, which most of the time you're not, you got to color it with something. The coloring situation, is one of those things that doesn't really get me in a twist so much because they usually use beta carotene, which is from, basically from carrots. So it's pretty harmless. It's just most consumers often feel kind of duped by it. And it's certainly something that the wild salmon industry has latched on. Keep in mind that there was no farm salmon, until in any amount until the 70s. And so when this whole huge wild salmon industry in Alaska was suddenly swamped with all this farm salmon, they needed a leg to stand on to make the argument. And so they argued very vociferously that, farm salmon were died, and they are through their feed. The other place that I've heard of colorants being used, it's not really a colorant, but they will blast tuna with carbon monoxide, and that will cause that red color to come out. And I think that has something to do with oxophilia or something within the flesh. Again, I'm not I always say I'm not this, I'm not that. Basically, it is I'm a writer and I'm a science writer, which is a career I love because I get to dip like exactly one toe into every discipline. So I know a little about a lot. But I do know that they do blast tuna with carbon monoxide to bring out that red color. So a lot of that like deli sushi that you'll see with that super red color is probably been blasted one way or another. Is that harmful? Probably not. It probably dissipates, but again, it's a little bit of a fake. It's harmful only in that you can take a really old piece of tuna and blast it with carbon monoxide, and it looks pretty good, and it could be off.
Yeah, I've seen tuna and salmon in all sorts of shades of red, so who
Yes.
knows what's what.
Yes.
We have a question. If it's okay with you, we're planning on doing Q&A up until 7:47 East Coast time, so 5 more minutes.
Yeah, that's great.
Right. From Stephen, in an agriculture intensive state like Michigan that borders 4 Great Lakes, how can we get land and water producers together to support food production and climate and economic goals? It's a big one.
Sounds like a thesis. I mean, I think I may have sent out to you guys an article I wrote called A River Runs Through It, which is where I spent a lot of time going down the Mississippi and talking to farmers. There are farmers out there who they don't want to be polluting the environment. There are a lot of farmers who, a lot of farmers are on their day off are hunters and fishermen, and they would like to be part of the solution to some degree. There are, different, I think, different kinds of alliances have come and gone between farmers and fishermen. At one point, I remember there were sort of, meetings happening between Gulf fishermen and soybean and corn farmers in the Midwest and talking about those kinds of things. The limiting factor is though that a lot of this stuff ends up being somewhat voluntary. There is something called what's a TMDL, a total maximum daily load of nutrients going into a river system, and some watersheds have instituted a mandatory TMDL. They have done that in the Chesapeake Bay. Is it working? Not really. But I've heard talk of wanting to do that on the Mississippi River to have a TMDL for the whole thing, so that basically kind of almost taking a fisheries approach. In fisheries, one of the things that really turned wild fisheries around was something called a catch share, where, before fishing even begins, you pre-sell the fish so that you're not allowed to overfish. If you're Jake from New Hampshire, you're allowed to catch 50 pounds of codfish. If you're somebody else, you have a different allocation. Same thing goes with nutrients, and the idea would be based on your farm, maybe you would have a certain number of total nutrients that you're allowed to do. It's a little bit like, carbon markets, right? So I think volunteerism is probably not going to work, but I think kind of like, we obviously are entering this really tough period of anti-regulatory behavior or legislation. But I think that rather than seeing land food and seafood producers as like enemies of ecosystems, we have to engage them as partners and get them to understand that, we're in this together. We want a stable food system. We don't want just blind profit. We want a stable system that's good for everybody in the end.
Yeah, that's good advice and super relevant. A lot of times farmers don't really understand what the impacts of their practices.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times it's just they don't know, and I think, having interaction with coastal people is an important thing. I think, one thing that Michigan suffers from and all the Great Lakes states suffer from is that you no longer have a commercial fishery on the American side of the Great Lakes. There used to be huge commercial fisheries, so there's no feedback loop. And so the people who are fishing now, I mean, there are huge recreational fisheries in the Great Lakes, but there tends to be a kind of a class difference between recreational fishermen and farmers. And so it ends up being this loggerhead situation where, the rec guys, the rich recreational fishermen are blaming the poor farmers, for messing up their ecosystem. And that, while I don't know if we'll ever get a viable commercial fishing back on the Great Lakes, I think missing that component, there's an old proverb, don't poop where you eat. Well, if we're not eating from the Great Lakes, then what's the compulsion to save them?
Great point. We're going to wrap up here with this last question, and we have about 1 minute left.
Yeah.
So this question creates space for a little call to action. Amanda asks, what do you believe is the most important thing for people to know in order to make more responsible decisions about their seafood consumption?
Very important to know where is your seafood coming from. And there are boxes within boxes of where. I tend to recommend that people buy American caught seafood. We do have some of the best fishing regulations in the world. And if they can identify American caught fish in the marketplace, then they're really ahead of things. Obviously, a lot of it is coming to us from farmed sources. There are some labels out there like the Marine Stewardship Council for wild fish and then the Aquaculture Stewardship Council for aquaculture product. Looking at those labels is probably a good thing to know, or knowing about those labels is a good thing. And then, it's not really a viable opportunity or option. There's a little bit in the Great Lakes, but for those people living in coastal communities, buying from local fishermen is an interesting and good way, I think, to support that kind of behavior. There is a website called localcatch.org, which identifies all of the what are called community-supported fisheries around the country, and some of them actually ship. So, like, there's a company called Sitka Salmon Shares that will ship portioned American seafood to your home. Kind of blew up during the pandemic. I think there are a couple of places in the Great Lakes that do that. But if you can't find local, then go for American.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. I know I'm personally super inspired by this talk, and again, super eager to engage more with your work. We're going to pass it on to Shiloh to sort of wrap up the session tonight and introduce us to next week's speaker briefly.
Okay, I will log off, and thank you so much for your attention, and I appreciate all the work that you guys are doing in Michigan.
Thank you so much, Paul. Take care.
Bye.
Before I introduce next week's speaker, I just want to share some exciting opportunities with you all. The campus farm at Mathi Botanical Gardens is hiring summer interns. So whether you're interested in food systems, food access, food justice, horticulture, community outreach, or something else, there's likely a perfect fit for you at Mathi. You can see the full list of internship opportunities on the University of Michigan Careers portal. Some of the internship positions available are the Campus Farm internship, Campus Farm Native Plants intern, Refugee Garden Youth Education intern, and the Indigenous Foodways intern, and more. Applications are due by Sunday, March 2nd, and you can find more info on the discussion board on Canvas. Next week's speaker will be Rowan White. Rowan is a seed keeper farmer from the Mohawk community of Akwesasne and a passionate activist for Indigenous seed and food sovereignty. She is the educational director and lead mentor for Sierra Seeds, an innovative Indigenous seed bank and land-based educational organization located in Nevada City, California. I'm really, really excited to welcome Rowan. I've been working with her on and off for several years, and I'm just excited for her to come and talk to our community. And with that, I think, Sammy, did you have any comments or anything to share before we say goodnight? All right, that's it. And with that, we'll see everyone next week. Take care.